They say that life imitates art, but sometimes, when life has left a hole in the hearts of the people affected by those events, or when the culture of those people themselves has been inextricably linked to these events, art is forced to depict life. I'm going to open up this video by saying that this is going to talk about a very serious range of topics. There's going to be, at least to as much as I can get within YouTube standards, graphic content discussed. I feel like it's either important to show you this, or when necessary, when I know that it can't be shown on here, recommend that you look up the series yourself for you to get the full experience and story. In this video, I want to talk about real life hardships, cruelty, and atrocities depicted through comics. It's easy to get caught up in the stories of the past or present with a magical, lighthearted twist, but today I want to look at stories that have affected people, both in the story and in real life. There are two that I want to speak about in depth. Persepolis, the story of a young woman coming of age throughout the Islamic Revolution, and Mouse, the graphic novel depicting the author's father's experiences surviving the Holocaust. It's important to talk about these subjects because when these stories come along, whether it's on the page or on the screen, people need to talk about harsh subjects. As an artist, author, mangaka, painter, sculptor, director, or anything else in the arts, it's important to look at subjects that are inherently uncomfortable at its base and further pushes the limits of what they are willing to subject themselves to. I want to explore and have a conversation about projects that depict something from real life cruelty and how to treat those subjects with respect. I know that when I come across something that is hard to watch or read, like the Holocaust, it feels genuinely uncomfortable. The anxiety builds up. You know what you're in for, but the way it's presented is always like taking a step into a deep drop. It's holding in a breath for a little bit too long. It's feeling your neck get pinched and finding it harder to breathe. Looking at that reaction, why would someone make their audience feel that way? Why would you want to make your audience feel that way? It's the same reason you'd want to discuss any subject with your audience. It's to send a message, to educate, to invoke a feeling of emotion or a reaction. At its base, storytelling can be simply defined as presenting a set of circumstances with the characters in it. The plot moves forward, and the characters involved are changed because of the plot. It might seem simple at one end when talking about a lighthearted subject. Maybe it was something funny, wacky, or interesting that happened and the characters changed because of it. But when speaking on a real life subject, this need for a message is deeper and more important. It's not a simple set of circumstances, it's talking about real people and real events. Sometimes characters in fiction act in extremely cruel ways, but it's easy to forget that those are usually inspired by actual people doing these things, and much, much worse to other actual people. Throughout the reviewing process, remember that these aren't just characters on a page. Real people are being depicted here. These are people who had their own lives, hopes, and aspirations that were stripped away from them, all because of the unimaginable cruelty of others. In Persepolis, we follow the story of the author, Marjane Satrapi, depicting events of her childhood through her eyes during the Islamic Revolution. It's about how her own life changed when seeing this revolution take place, how freedoms were stripped away, and how the government changed the daily lives of her and her family, how this affected her upbringing, and how the Shah and his new regime started to cross into the boundaries of evil and brutality. While she explores the first small changes in her life, being forced to wear a veil, starting to see other protesters rise up against the regime, and other smaller sequences of changes, we come across one of our first real scenes of savagery. We see a scene of the Shah and the police department burning down a cinema. They lock the people inside. The police were there, standing guard of this burning building, refusing to help those that were locked inside. The reason why I bring this up is that we as an audience need to pay attention to how this is presented and how different readers will react to that scene. As someone who grew up in the US, I obviously see the horror that's on display. There's a childlike sketch of flames turning into people, people desperately trying to escape from the hellscape they're locked into. You know that their efforts are useless, that on the other side of the doors of this theater, there are people who are not going to help them. In fact, if they were to somehow miraculously escape, the result could have been just as devastating. But that's how I see it, as someone who didn't grow up with it. But remember that these scenes aren't always written for someone like me in mind. Satrapi is writing about her personal experiences with the revolution and realize that this scene is going to hit much harder and be much more emotional for those who lived either during this time frame or in the aftermath of it. How many people reading this were personally impacted? Maybe they had family members who were killed. Maybe they had family members who were part of the Shah's regime or the police force who orchestrated this. Maybe they've only heard stories from their parents about this time, but that this is the first time they've seen it reflected in media. There are acts of unspeakable torture depicted in Persepolis, but they have a way of seeming horrific and childlike at the same time. These images are depicted with a lack of detail, again due to this being through a child's eyes, but that is juxtaposed by the disgusting acts that are on display. Torture, burnings, and dismemberment. It's not gory per se. This is not some story with blood and guts spilling everywhere. This looks more like how a child would see a piece of meat at the butcher and put a face on it. It's because we're seeing this medium through a child's eye that these events are shocking but digestible at the same time. Given the subject matter, if these events were drawn in graphic detail, the author's message about these crimes against humanity could be lost on people who are going to put the book down due to not being able to stomach it. Satrapi subverts this through the drawing of the acts, and because they're not gory, people will continue to read further and keep learning about these events in her life. Perhaps this was their first exposure to real-life events of the Iranian Revolution, and seeing this used as a vehicle to present these experiences are the ways to open their minds to diving deeper into this subject. In fact, we even see this exact concept when Satrapi speaks with her uncle about communism and how she learned about it from a comic book. I think that Satrapi's quote from this article with Sotheby's, which is linked below, says it best. When she was asked why she chose to share this story through a graphic novel, she says, "First of all, the primary language of human beings is drawing, not writing. Drawing is a universal language, and if you want to describe an emotion, when you draw someone with that emotion, no matter where you come from, you understand it." Strangely enough, in the same interview, she did mention that this next subject of the video was a direct influence in terms of her learning that comic books could be used to tell serious stories. Mouse, written and illustrated by Art Spiegelman, opens with a quote from Adolf Hitler. It reads, "The Jews are undoubtedly a race, but they're not human." I think it's important to highlight this given that we are impacted by an extremely vile statement, and it puts the reader's head in a certain space before they even see a single panel of the novel. Purpose of a comment like this being in the book at all, specifically in a book describing the horrors of the Holocaust, is that you as the reader have to understand and brace yourself for the mindset of the time, what the leaders of these countries were saying publicly and openly, and to see how this dynamic is represented throughout the book. In the book, all of the characters are anthropomorphic. The Polish are pigs, the Jews are mice, and the Germans are cats. Obvious first metaphor is that cats hunt and eat mice. The fear plagues the Jews at every turn, seeing symbols of the Nazis for the first time and witnessing their slow and growing stranglehold on the region. Throughout the story, Vladek, the author's father, tells his story of survival. Much like Persepolis, Maus shows that this initially small started to a takeover of the Nazi and Hitler's reign, and how their lives were uprooted due to this wave of anti-Semitic feelings, actions, and laws. The restrictions to travel, how they're being monitored, and the amount of alternatives shrinking every day. The feelings of the Jewish people understandably change over time, initially living within the confines of the law, but quickly realizing that this is just the start of the new war that they'll be facing. What will people do when this pressure continues to build up? Will people stay together as a community? Will they shrink that feeling to just their extended family? Perhaps to just their immediate family? Or what about just themselves? As time continues, it becomes worse and worse. The Star of David is forced on every Jew underneath the heel of the Germans, and on every horrific panel of the growing cruelty, we're reminded that this group at the forefront isn't just a group. There are names, there are stories with each person. These images are brought to us through a minimalist style, but at the same time, it connects us to these people that have died nearly 90 years ago. The people are brought into our lives only to be ripped away just as quickly. The feelings of Vladek throughout the story are always made clear to us. While reading, think about the differences between Persepolis and Maus depicting these events. If these two were speaking about the same story, how would they be portrayed differently? With the former being a child's view, with a child's rendition and memory to the events, also think how it's different for a child in these situations versus an adult. Satrapi is a child and is protected, at least in the best way that she can be, to many of the real life horrors of the situation. On the other hand, Vladek is in his early 30s by this point in the story. He has a wife and son. He's seen war. The stresses and the way that society treats them are inherently different. In stories like these, whether from your own perspective or others, the way that society treats the character that you're focusing on will be drastically different for even the smallest of reasons. Further, these stories are different through the lens of their perspective. Satrapi tells through her eyes, and Spiegelman interlaces his own story with his father's. His father's a hard man to deal with. He has health issues. He gets on Spiegelman's nerves. He berates him or fusses over small and inconsequential things. As Spiegelman works through his own journey of speaking about this difficult topic with his father and how he's trying to get closer to him through this story, Vladek is also working through a different set of circumstances with his past as the story unfolds. It's obvious that his father survived the Holocaust, but the tension with the narrative is related to how he survived, how much he ended up going through, and the people that were taken from him. Spiegelman does an amazing job with every turn of the page. The fear is palpable. You keep interacting with Vladek with his growing health concerns and with his erratic behavior, and you can't help but think what kind of person he would be if he wasn't in the Holocaust. When the story finally gets to Auschwitz, where the second volume of Maus is mostly set, it's horror after horror. They have already gone through so much, but you know that it's only the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to get worse as time goes on. Some of the most dehumanizing parts of the entire story are on display here, and from the survivor's perspective and experiences, it's so close and detailed that no amount of reading can prepare you for it. Like many of you, I learned about the war and the Holocaust in school, but it never went into the detail that we see here. Spiegelman goes into so much detail on the conditions and the barbaric actions by the Guard that I actually had to put the book down for a few times and take a break. This is back to our question of why you'd want to have your reader experience these emotional tolls. It's nothing compared to what the people themselves had to go through, but being forced to look at this atrocity in graphic detail is exactly why the book was written and presented to us. This story matters. Those who were killed matter, and those who survived and tried to live past this matter. One piece that hasn't been mentioned is the struggle that any artist has with depicting these subjects while they are just observers. Spiegelman tells us how 100,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed at Auschwitz in the manner of 8 days. This is compared to his own successes based on telling people this tragedy. He feels guilt and is depressed because of how he has figuratively built this new success and respect on their graves. This story needs to be told. Vladek and the others who are depicted in this story deserve to be known to the wider world, but can you truly make an argument for everyone needing to see it if you're profiting off of their suffering? It's not a question for me to answer despite some strong personal feelings. That's for you and the authors of these stories. So, how does one still put these stories out while still respecting the real people who are involved? I think it comes from a few places. First, Spiegelman shows how people try to monopolize this product as much as possible, with movie deals, merchandise, and the like, and how he turned those opportunities down. There's a fine line in putting something out and taking advantage of it. Before anything is released depicting a real life event, I'd argue that the creator needs to have a serious discussion with those involved and those who remember in terms of their thoughts on being depicted in this way, and knowing that you're going to get a wide variety of answers. With something as expansive and wide reaching as the Holocaust, the feelings of anguish from just the subject matter alone is going to affect people differently who are in the same family, much less people who are only related through being Jewish. Second, when specifically portraying a race or group of people, there's always a fear of perpetuating stereotypes. Spiegelman says this explicitly when discussing his father and his obsession with not spending money. He doesn't want to give power to anti Semitic stereotypes that only serve to hurt the message of the story, as it's also used as an insult launched at Jews throughout the story. In an interview with New York Magazine, again linked below, he says that he chose to portray the Jews as mice because he saw a very heavy on the air quotes, a mid Hitler reign German documentary where the Jews were depicted as rats hiding in the sewers, along with a title card that said that they were the vermin of mankind. Spiegelman says, "This made it clear to me that this dehumanization was at the heart of the killing project." Zyklon B, which is referenced extensively in the book, was a pesticide that was used to specifically kill vermin. This was later used in the gas chambers during the Holocaust. To the Nazis, the connection was deliberate. Throughout reading both of these stories, I think that the authors took the care and the time to do both of the above. These two steps are crucial. There needs to be a true, complete, and critical view of the potential impacts of works like these, or else you are going to run into various issues that are better left alone. As a final note, I think that the purposes of these books should be clear to anyone who reads them. They use comics as a vessel to explain these tragedies in a way that's digestible and reaches a wider audience who would otherwise be unfamiliar with it. If you haven't read either of these, I would suggest you pick them up immediately. Although, in some sense of cruel irony, despite the lessons in both books, you might have some issues picking them up depending on your situation. Book bans, which have recently made headlines in places like Florida, are nothing new for these books. Both articles on screen are over a year old, and the people pearl clutching at the graphic content of both don't understand the purposes for that graphic content. It's so frustrating to see, and I really hope that by some miracle, someone involved in these bannings takes a closer look at the decisions and recognizes the errors of their ways. If you live somewhere where these books are banned, Hopefully, this inspires you in some way, shape, or form to stand up and defend the art that we've seen today. That's going to be it for today's video. I really want to thank you for watching, and I'm sorry that this one was a little bit more morbid, but I truly and deeply feel that it needed to be talked about. I decided that I wanted to do one video that didn't focus on manga specifically, just to get another perspective from other sources. I know that one of the most famous manga, Barefoot Gen, covers the real life events of the bombing of Hiroshima, but I thought it would be interesting to highlight something outside of manga specifically. Let me know what you think. Again, given the material, I hope that you are still able to see why this is important to cover, and perhaps it will help you learn from these examples if you decide to make something that also depicts real life historical events. If you have an idea for the next video, feel free to comment it down below. If you want to see more content that's like this, that's hopefully on a cheerier subject, feel free to check out the rest of the channel. Thanks again. This was Panel Flow.